Hi, Miss Jaden's class. I know you guys really loved when we read The Witches together, and so I'm going to continue to read it to you guys out loud. So yeah, I'll just read probably 2-ish chapters every day, so let's get reading together. Sorry, class, it's kind of weird making videos for you guys. I wish you were just here. So the chapter that we're on is called Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins Meet Bruno. Ooh, do you guys remember who Bruno is? The other mouse, the other boy who got turned into a mouse. Okay. My grandmother carried me back into her own bedroom and put me on the table. She set the precious bottle down beside me. What time are those witches eating? What time are those witches having supper in the dining room? She asked. 8 o'clock, I said. She looked at her watch. It's now 10:06, she said. We've got until 8 o'clock to work out our next move. Suddenly, her eye fell upon Bruno. He was still in the banana bowl by the table. He had eaten 3 bananas and was now attacking a 4th. He had become immensely fat. That's quite enough, my grandmother said, lifting him out of the bowl and putting him on the tabletop. I think it's time we return this little fellow to the bosom of his family. Don't you agree, Bruno? Bruno scowled at her. I had never seen a mouse scowl before, but he managed it. My parents let me eat as much as I want, he said. I'd rather be with them than you. Of course you would, my grandmother said. Do you know where your parents might be at this moment? They were in the lounge not long ago, I said. I saw them sitting there as we dashed on our way up here. Right, my grandmother said. Let's go and see if they are still there. Do you want to come along? She added, looking at me. Yes, please, I said. I shall put you both in my handbag, she said. Keep quiet and stay out of sight. If you must peep out now and again, don't show more than your nose. Her handbag was a large, bulgy black leather affair with a tortoiseshell clasp. She picked up Bruno and me and popped us into it. I shall leave the clasp undone, she said, but be sure to keep out of sight. I had no intention of keeping out of sight. I wanted to see everything. I seated myself in a little side pocket inside the bag, near the clasp, and from there I was able to poke my head out whenever I wanted to. Hey, Bruno called out, give me the rest of the banana I was eating. Oh, all right, my grandmother said, anything to keep you quiet. She dropped the half-eaten banana into the bag, then slung the bag over her arm and marched out of the room and went thumping along the corridor with her walking stick. We went down in the lift to the ground floor and made our way through the reading room to the lounge. And there, sure enough, sat Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins in a couple of armchairs with a low, round, glass-covered table between them. There were several other groups in there as well, but the Jenkinses were the only couple sitting alone. Mr. Jenkins was reading a newspaper. Mrs. Jenkins was knitting something large and mustard-colored. Only my nose and eyes were above the clasp of my grandmother's handbag, but I had a super view. I could see everything. My grandmother, dressed in black lace, went thumping across the floor of the lounge and halted in front of the Jenkinses' table. Are you Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins? She asked. Mr. Jenkins looked at her over the top of his newspaper and frowned. Yes, he said. I am Mr. Jenkins. What can I do for you, madam? I'm afraid I have some rather alarming news for you, she said. It's about your son, Bruno. What about Bruno? Mr. Jenkins said. Mrs. Jenkins looked up but went on knitting. What's the little blighter been up to now? Mr. Jenkins asked. Raiding the kitchen, I suppose? It's a bit worse than that, my grandmother said. Do you think we might go somewhere more private while I tell you about it? Private? Mr. Jenkins said. Why do we have to be private? This is not an easy thing for me to explain, my grandmother said. Okay, I want you guys to see the picture. You see that? I'd much rather we all went up to your room and sat down before I tell you any more. Mr. Jenkins lowered his paper. Mrs. Jenkins stopped knitting. I don't want to go up to my room, madam, Mr. Jenkins said. I'm quite comfortable here, thank you very much. He was a large, coarse man, and he wasn't used to being pushed around by anybody. Kindly state your business and then leave us alone, he added. He spoke as though he was addressing someone who was trying to sell him a vacuum cleaner at the back door. My poor grandmother, who had been doing her best to be as kind as possible, now began to bristle a bit herself. We really can't talk in here, she said. There are too many people. This is a rather delicate and personal matter. I'll talk where I dashed well want to, madam, Mr. Jenkins said. Come on now, out with it. If Bruno has broken a window or damaged your spectacles, then I'll pay for the damage, but I'm not budging out of the seat. One or two other groups in the room were beginning to stare at us. Now, where is Bruno anyway? Mr. Jenkins said. Tell him to come here and see me. He's here already, my grandmother said. He's in my handbag. She patted the big floppy leather bag with her walking stick. What the heck do you mean he's in your handbag? Mr. Jenkins shouted. Are you trying to be funny? Mrs. Jenkins said, very prim. There's nothing funny about this, my grandmother said. Your son has suffered a rather unfortunate mishap. He's always suffering mishaps, Mr. Jenkins said. He suffers from overeating, and then he suffers from wind. You should hear him after supper. He sounds like a brass band, but a good dose of castor oil soon puts him right away. Where is the little beggar? I've already told you, my grandmother said. He's in my handbag, but I do think it might be better if we went somewhere private before you meet him in this present state. This woman's mad, Mrs. Jenkins said. Tell her to go away. The plain fact is, my grandmother said, that your son Bruno has been drastically altered. Altered? Shouted Mr. Jenkins. What the devil do you mean altered? Go away, Mrs. Jenkins said. You're a silly old woman. I am trying to tell you, as gently as I possibly can, that Bruno really is in my handbag, my grandmother said. My own grandson actually saw them doing it to him. Saw who doing what to him, for heaven's sakes, shouted Mr. Jenkins. He had a black mustache which jumped up and down when he shouted. Saw the witches turning him into a mouse, my grandmother said. Call the manager, dear, Mrs. Jenkins said to her husband. Have this mad woman thrown out of the hotel. At this point, my grandmother's patience came to an end. She fished around in her handbag and found Bruno. She lifted him out and dumped him on the glass-top table. Mrs. Jenkins took one look at the fat little brown mouse who was still chewing a bit of banana, and she let out a shriek that rattled the crystals on the chandelier. She sprang out of her chair yelling, It's a mouse! Take it away! I can't stand the things! It's Bruno, my grandmother said. You nasty, cheeky old woman, shouted Mr. Jenkins. He started flapping his newspaper at Bruno, trying to sweep him off the table. My grandmother rushed forward and managed to grab hold of him before he was swept away. Mrs. Jenkins was still screaming her head off, and Mr. Jenkins was towering over us and shouting, Get out of here! How dare you frighten my wife like that? Take your filthy mouse away this instant! Help! Screamed Mrs. Jenkins. Her face had gone the color of the underside of a fish. Well, I did my best, my grandmother said. And with that, she turned and sailed out of the room, carrying Bruno with her. So what do you think, guys? Did it go well? Did Bruno's parents want to see him, or did they believe, forgot the main character's name, but did they believe our character's grandma that Bruno had turned into a mouse? Doesn't sound like it to me, huh? Okay, we're gonna read one more chapter today, and this chapter is called The Plan. There's no pictures. Okay. When we got back to the bedroom, my grandmother took me and Bruno out of her handbag and put us on the table. Why on earth didn't you speak up and tell your father who you were? She said to Bruno. Because I had my mouth full, Bruno said. He jumped straight back into the bowl of bananas and went on with his eating. What a very disagreeable little boy you are, my grandmother said to him. Not boy, I said, mouse. Quite right, my darling, but we don't have time to worry about him at the moment. We have plans to make. In about an hour and a half's time, all the witches will be going down to supper in the dining room, right? Right, I said. And every one of them has got to be given a dose of mouse maker, she said. How on earth are we going to do that? Grandmama, I said, I think you are forgetting that a mouse can go places where human beings can't. That's quite right, she said. But even a mouse can't go creeping around on the tabletop carrying a bottle and sprinkling mouse maker all over the witch's roast beef without being spotted. I wasn't thinking of doing it in the dining room, I said. Then where? She asked. In the kitchen, I said, while their food is being got ready. My grandmother stared at me. Ugh, sorry guys, I gotta move. My darling child, she said slowly, I do believe that turning you into a mouse has doubled your brain power. A little mouse, I said, can go scuttling around the kitchen among the pots and pans, and if he's very careful, no one will ever see him. Brilliant, my grandmother cried out. By golly, I think you've got this. The only thing is, I said, how will I know which food is theirs? I don't want to put it in the wrong saucepan. It would be disastrous if I turned all the other guests into mice by mistake. And especially you, Grandmama. Then you'll just have to creep into the kitchen and find a good hiding place and wait. And listen. Just lie there in some dark cranny listening to what the cooks are saying. And then, with a bit of luck, somebody's going to give you a clue. Whenever they have a big party to cook for, the food is always prepared separately. Right, I said. That's what I'll have to do. I shall wait there and I shall listen and I shall hope for a bit of luck. It's going to be dangerous, my grandmother said. Nobody welcomes a mouse in the kitchen. If they see you, they'll squash you to death. I won't let them see me, I said. Don't forget you'll be carrying the bottle, she said, so you won't be nearly so quick and nippy. I can run quite fast standing up with the bottle in my arms, I said. I did it just now. Don't you remember? I came all the way up from the Grand High Witch's room carrying it. What about unscrewing the top, she said. That might be difficult for you. Let me try, I said. I took hold of the little bottle and using both my front paws, I found I was able to unscrew the cap quite easily. Okay guys, here's the picture of the little mouse. That's great, my grandmother said. You really are a very clever mouse. She glanced at her watch. At 7:30, she said, I shall go down to the dining room for supper with you in my handbag. I shall then release you under the table together with the precious bottle, and from then on you'll be on your own. You will have to work your way unseen across the dining room to the door that leads into the kitchen. There will be waiters going in and out of that door all the time. You will have to choose the right moment and nip in behind one of them. But for heaven's sake, be sure that you do not get trodden on or squeezed in the door. I'll try not to, I said. And whatever happens, you mustn't let them catch you. Don't go on about it, Grandmama. You're making me nervous. You're a brave little fellow, she said. I do love you. What shall we do with Bruno? I asked her. Bruno looked up. I'm coming with you, he said, speaking with his mouth full of banana. I'm not going to miss my supper. My grandmother considered this for a moment. I'll take you along, she said, if you promise to stay in my bag and keep absolutely silent. Will you pass food down to me from the table? Bruno asked. Yes, she said, if you promise to behave yourself. Would you like something to eat, my darling? She said to me. No, thank you, I said. I'm too excited to eat, and I've got to keep fit and frisky for the big job ahead. It's a big job, all right, my grandmother said. You'll never do a bigger one. Okay, awesome, guys. That was 2 chapters. So I hope you're liking the story so far, and we're about to see what happens when they make their big plan. I can't wait for you to hear more tomorrow. Bye.